I should start by admitting that I struggled to enjoy HBO's The Last of Us while watching it my first time. Going in as a longtime fan of the game, it was impossible for me not to feel skeptical of what an adaptation could possibly add to what the game already accomplished. My estimation of The Last of Us has always been that it was a fairly simple story told profoundly well. As good as it was, that was never down to its originality, as it is very much indebted to the tropes of the zombie apocalypse subgenre and video games at large, as well as to the aesthetics and pacing of prestige drama. Which is to say, The Last of Us as a game already feels a lot like an HBO show, so the hypothesis I couldn't help but form was that turning The Last of Us into an actual HBO series would only serve to dilute it. Look no further than what happened with the Uncharted movie, another adaptation of a Naughty Dog series also stylistically defined by its cinematic pastiche. This led the folks at Sony to believe that an Uncharted film would just make itself apparently, because they didn't seem to put in much effort, producing an utterly forgettable film with none of the original's charm. There were a lot of problems with that movie, don't get me wrong, but the central one was the assumption that because Uncharted had cinematic written in its DNA, that it would translate well into cinema, an assumption that gives the game half of video game so little credit in making those stories so memorable and fun. Now, all that said, HBO's The Last of Us is not the Uncharted movie. The people here clearly cared a lot about making a quality product, and it shows. The series has received overwhelming acclaim from critics and fans alike, ignoring the small but loud contingent of weirdos who hate anything they perceive as having a progressive agenda, of course. I'm glad that people like the show, it's nice for people to enjoy things, but personally, my reaction to the show was pretty on point with my initial hypothesis. It brings the story to life with all the gloss of an HBO budget, yet its loyalty to that original story often feels in tension with how much it is changed for the sake of being digestible as a TV show. This isn't to say that changing for the sake of a new medium is bad, quite the contrary, in fact. I often felt it was the show's refusal to stray too far from the game's exact events that made it frustrating to me, as if it didn't realize that taking out everything the gameplay brought to the storytelling would fundamentally change how everything that's still there works. To give a quick and very reductive review of the show, I went into it not thinking there was much a television adaptation of The Last of Us could add to what the game already gave us, and it didn't do much to change my mind. With that said, The Last of Us is not a bad show, far from it, and while I disagree with a lot of the creator's adaptational choices, I still think those choices are interesting and worth examining, which is what I'll be doing here. I want to be very clear that this isn't about tearing the show apart. It doesn't deserve that the way something like the Uncharted movie does, though I will be roasting it a bit where I think it deserves roasting, for fun and for honesty's sake. This is ultimately an exercise in analysis and understanding, and honestly, writing about the show has softened many of my initial grievances. While I still prefer the game in pretty much every way, the show is well executed in its own right, and accomplishes exactly what it set out to in recreating the tale of Joel and Ellie for television audiences. And taking a close look at how this story is told across two different mediums reveals compelling things about both. It's more than just a matter of which scenes get included and which don't, since the nature of how those scenes get presented differ greatly between mediums. The game has its cutscenes which function like little movies, yes, but most of it consists of exploring areas at your own pace, scavenging for items, solving light puzzles, and eventually engaging in combat before repeating that general loop. This isn't just filler between narrative moments in the cutscenes though, as through it all Ellie and Joel are constantly talking. I doubt there's any point with the two of them that more than a minute goes by without Ellie commenting on something or another and an organic exchange developing from there. It's such a naturalistic approach to characterization, completely unique to the way we play games, built on the accumulation of these minute interactions that don't mean much individually, but amount to incredibly authentic and nuanced feeling characters. The show, conversely, doesn't have the leisure of player-controlled pacing. It can't linger in the game's ambiance. It has to be deliberate with every scene and every line, has to know what it's doing with every given moment. This alone demands huge changes to the way the characters are written, which is to say nothing of the fact that many of the show's scenes follow entirely different characters from Joel and Ellie altogether. Most of said characters are in the game, but are never afforded screen time at the expense of the main duo like they are here, meaning we're much less zoomed in on Joel and Ellie's experience, given a broader range of perspectives, which changes so much about how we see this world and how we come to understand the people within it. So in order to better understand the differences here and how they work in context of each version's storytelling, I'll be closely examining the progression of both versions of The Last of Us from beginning to end. Understand that this will not be a comprehensive encyclopedic collection of every little difference between adaptations, so much as a broader comparison in how each strives to accomplish the same things with different tools. Or as is sometimes the case, when what one version is trying to accomplish differs from the other's intention and why that may be. If that sounds like your thing, then you're in the right place, and there's nowhere better to start than the very beginning. Right off the bat, the show has a lot to live up to, as the opening sequence of the game is among its most celebrated moments. In a tight 15 minutes, we progress from the warmth of Sarah and Joel bonding over a birthday gift through an escalation of tension and terror as the world collapses around them, the ferocious new threat of the infected striking an utterly unprepared population with fatal efficiency. We actually play as Sarah for most of the sequence, not doing much besides looking on, made to feel small and powerless. From a hardline gameplay stance, this can feel less like a video game and more like a Universal Studios ride. But goddamn if it isn't one hell of a ride, and when you do switch over to Joel and have to run with Sarah in your arms and the infected one slow turn away from chomping on your ankles, the tension is palpable. It of course ends in tragedy, a soldier shooting Sarah who bleeds out in Joel's arms. Killing a child in the first scene of your game could easily come off a bit tasteless if done poorly, but man do they nail this moment. There were bits in my most recent playthrough where, as a whole, this sequence was starting to show its age, but the note it ends on is timeless. The raw performance from Troy Baker, the music, the timing on the cut to title, such perfect execution, all setting us up for the harrowing nature of the story to come. The show follows these same steps to the same effect, while also expanding upon the day of the outbreak, drawing out the building tension over the entire day. The best thing about this is the extra time we get between Sarah and Joel, further showing how much their dynamic reflects what we'll eventually see between him and Ellie. Aside from this, we exclusively follow Sarah through her day, though not a whole lot really happens other than the continuous building of unease that something bad is about to happen. By the time we reach that pivotal scene of Joel cradling Sarah's body in his arms, the intro has hit all the notes it needed to match its predecessor, but altogether I feel its expansion was not as profitable as it could have been. We spent surprisingly little of our time in 2003 with Joel, the show sticking to Sarah much like the game did, but where that made sense with how briefly we were in that version's prologue and how we were meant to feel disempowered, only showing Sarah when that is no longer a limitation feels, well, like an unnecessary limitation. Would it not have been more thematically rewarding to get a better picture of Joel in the pre-apocalypse, see what he was like under normal societal conditions, maybe see how he handled conflict at work or something, before living in a world where conflict means violence by default? Even just more time spent watching the world collapse from Joel's point of view would have been interesting. I would like to have seen Joel going to get Tommy from that jail. A police station hours before all hell breaks loose could have made for a great scene, where Joel realizes, holy shit, this is for real. I gotta get back to my daughter. You might say that since the game didn't need any of this, the show doesn't either, but from that point of view, I fail to see how expanding the prologue was necessary at all, what it adds that a more condensed, to-the-point sequence wouldn't have accomplished. The result is that about a third of the series' opening episode goes toward this, while the back two-thirds work to set the larger story in motion. We hit an extraordinary emotional high 30 minutes in, then have another 50 minutes that shift dramatically in setting and tone, and demand we now start following a slew of characters who weren't relevant to that first 30 minutes at all. It just makes for a lumpy feeling episode to me. If the prologue had to be expanded, I'd rather have just seen it split into its own episode, giving the whole pre-apocalypse sequence the space to do more than the games could, and allowing the following section in Boston to stand more confidently on its own. Before that, I have to get more complaints off my chest, specifically regarding the 1968 talk show cold open for the first episode. I'm fully willing to admit that maybe I'm missing something here, maybe there's an intellectual reason for starting the show this way, but to me it just came off as a dry and straightforwardly lazy way of expositing at us about cordyceps. It also really bugs me the way everyone in the room is so deeply disturbed by what the mycologist says, the host being near speechless. It just feels so dramatically inauthentic. Why are these people so freaked out? Is this the tone that 1960s talk shows went for? Would it not have been more ominous for the host to just crack a joke and for everyone to laugh off what the mycologist is saying? Would that not have better enhanced the idea that we're oblivious to the fragility of the world as we know it? Like when the mycologist says to the 1968 audience that it would take a global temperature increase in order to create conditions where the cordyceps might evolve to infect humans, that should have been a people who don't know people who know moment, where we, the real-life 2023 audience, are the people who know. But it sort of feels like everyone here is the people who know, as if the show doesn't trust us to understand why they're including this bit if they don't spell out why it should haunt us. It lacks subtlety, and frankly, I feel like the Jakarta scene that opens episode 2, which already works much better, could have been tweaked to include what necessary exposition on the cordyceps was needed, and this talk show bit could have been dropped altogether. Let's move on to Boston, though. To flip the critical edge for a moment, thinking back to the game, this section has always been the least remarkable to me, feeling purely functional in how it sets up Joel's place in the world and gets the gears moving for the story at hand. We don't see enough of Boston for it to ever feel alive in the game, So it's good that the show's impeccable set design and greater attention to world building make it a much richer setting in the brief time we're there. We get more of the kinds of scenes I wanted out of the intro, of Joel just going about his life, selling drugs to guards and cutting in line at Boston's last Radio Shack, all of it insightful to the human experience of this miserable new era. In the game, we cut right to Joel and Tess discussing some dude named Robert who's trying to have them killed, so they have to get one over on him. Then they proceed to do so. It's the game's first real serving of what The Last of Us is as a gameplay experience, seeing Joel and Tess lurking around the Boston QZ en route to their target, then taking out that target with brutal efficiency. Or more likely, with sloppy dumb luck, as you get a feel for The Last of Us' distinctly weighty movement and combat. The show moves pieces around, making for a more complex plot progression than the straightforwardness of the game. Now we meet Tess prior to seeing her with Joel, and it's a decent scene showing that Joel and Tess are feared among the Boston underworld. Except they decided to end the scene by having the wall explode, apparently because of fighting going on between the government and the Fireflies. Like, I get the intent to show how dangerous Boston has become due to the war, and to better set up the Fireflies as a militant faction. But literally blowing a hole in an otherwise completely unrelated scene to accomplish this feels clumsy. So far, small potatoes, but an actual substantial change is that Joel now has his own motivation for wanting to cross the country even before stumbling into Ellie and the main plot. He's apparently been in contact with Tommy over the radio until somewhat recently. So, worried, he and Tess are planning to leave Boston and seek Tommy out. More than anything else on my first viewing, this was really hard for me to swallow, because it's such a sharp deviation from where Joel is at the start of the game. We eventually learn in that version of the story that Joel and Tommy parted on bad terms, and it doesn't seem like Joel had any interest in seeking out Tommy prior to needing him to find the Fireflies. This sad detachment from his only living relative saying a lot about how Joel has coped with his trauma in the decades since the end of the world. So for Joel to already be motivated to find Tommy to the point that he and Tess have a whole plan which Joel seems to obsess over in his free time, well, it's quite the change. Perhaps the writers felt that Joel needed more personal motivation, that his deciding to go across the country with Ellie for the sake of Tess's dying wish was a bit flimsy, which I suppose it is, but this is still questionable for me. You're telling me that Joel would have ended up in Jackson with Tommy even if he never decided to help Ellie? That just feels wrong, doesn't it? It's missing the growth we see take place in Game Joel across his journey, or maybe better put, the reawakening of humanity we see in him, as his time with Ellie opens him up to the idea of embracing his love for others once more, including his long-lost brother. That said, this heightened care for family that TV Joel displays is consistent with other changes to his character. Consider the role of violence in the episode, specifically as it relates to Joel. Throughout the Boston scenes, we're given the sense that Joel is a rough man who's done some rough things, and he expresses intent to do such things again when he and Tess seek out Robert to get even. However, we don't end up seeing Joel hurt anyone until the end of the episode, where a guard is poised to shoot Ellie and Joel just goes ham on him. It shows well enough Joel's capacity for violence, no doubt, but also clearly weighs on him. In episode 5, when Joel comes upon the sniper who's been attacking them, he tries not to kill him, practically begging the guy not to fight back. But of course he does. All this goes to show that TV Joel is fundamentally less apathetic towards life and humanity than Game Joel. He's still hanging on to some semblance of meaning beyond bare-knuckled survival, and his desire to seek out Tommy is reflective of that. Within TV Joel is that same cold killer mentality as his game counterpart, even if we aren't allowed to fully see it yet, whereas Game Joel is comparably shameless in showing us his true self at the earliest possible moment. This isn't to say that Game Joel is some husk of a man, empty of any redeeming qualities, not at all. His relationship with Tess shows that the man who was Joel Miller is still very much alive. He still cracks jokes, he's still got a romantic streak, and he still worries about the people he can't help but care for. He just also has no qualms about brutal murder, be it by strangling, stabbing, burning, shooting, and often just straight up beating. And no, not exclusively in self-defense, as the game makes a point of right away, with the scenes in Boston seeing Joel and Tess going on the offensive against Robert's crew, all of it treated as another day at the office. Game Joel's not going to feel sulky tomorrow because he blew up 3 dudes with a nail bomb. He'll probably sleep soundly knowing he saved the bullets. Of course, we have to afford the game some liberties, and read its events not as literal, but perhaps as exaggerations. It would of course be fucking ridiculous for anyone to kill the amount of human beings that Joel kills in this game and not get killed along the way. Not to mention that we're sure to witness Joel get shot, burned, beaten, all that good stuff, and, wrap a bandage around it and just keep on trucking. Because that's just the nature of games. Design trumps realism in most cases. Even so, the presence of such graphic violence and the ease with which Joel enacts it does tell us a lot about the character, about how violence has become the de facto language of this world, and Joel now speaks it fluently. Even discounting the gameplay segments, we get a hearty showing of what may as well be canonical violence in the cutscenes, where Joel and Tess corner Robert, then proceed to torture information on their stolen contraband out of him before unceremoniously executing him. I'd be curious if TV Joel would have gone about this in a similar way, but the show doesn't quite yet want us to see how much violence Joel has within him, setting Joel up for a completely different arc than in the game. With Robert dead, Joel and Tess have a need to talk to Marlene. The show's changes to the setup feel intended to make this happen more believably, since in the game, Marlene just kind of shows up at this part like, hey guys, want a job? So that's for the best. This change of context does shorten the time Joel and Tess have to speak with Marlene though, the game seeing you trek through Boston's back streets and rooftops with her before eventually getting introduced to Ellie. Marlene, interestingly, is actually played by the same actress in both versions of the story, which, if anything, makes the distinctions between these portrayals all the more apparent. Show Marlene feels more hardened, more openly frustrated by her rebellion struggles. She treats her subordinates with impatience, whereas game Marlene, well, we don't really see her interact with other Fireflies very much at all, almost as a way of highlighting that they're pretty much all dead. Marlene even has a line which, if she's to be believed, suggests the government has been scapegoating the Fireflies for a while, blowing the actions of the resistance out of proportion. She's actually been planning on leaving Boston, whereas I get the impression Show Marlene only decides to pull out of the city after discovering Ellie's immunity, realizing she has a better fight to fight than the one she's losing in Boston. So backed into a corner, Marlene turns to Tess and Joel, mostly because, well, they happen to be right there, and she knows their reputations. So they take the job, and Ellie reluctantly enters their care. It's worth noting as well that her and Marlene's relationship differs, not in the facts of it, but only in that Show Ellie isn't aware of their connection until just before meeting Joel, while game Ellie has known Marlene a while and speaks about her like a family friend. In the show, Ellie, and we, the audience, are more reliant on Joel's perspective of Marlene, whom he seems to respect but also kinda resent, blaming her and her cause for separating him and his brother, a cause he clearly doesn't think too highly of. Still, he knows she doesn't fuck around, so he trusts that this job will pay off. Which it does, if not in the way either Joel or Marlene intended. The last significant change is the already mentioned encounter with the guard, or pair of guards as it happens in-game, which outs Ellie as infected. In-game, Tess and Joel take out the guards, and Ellie seems shaken, remarking that she didn't expect they'd have to kill them, whereas TV Joel kills the one guard and Ellie just stares, in a way that seemed kind of shocked to me. But I don't have to interpret this, because the creators were benevolent enough to just tell us that we're meant to see this as Ellie being activated by violence. Yeah folks, Joel's not the only character whose arc has been tweaked quite a bit under the hood, as TV Ellie's relationship to violence doesn't perfectly reflect her game counterparts either. We'll dissect this more later, but for now we leave the QZ behind and move on to the horrors of downtown Boston. Episode 2 starts with the aforementioned Jakarta scene, which does a much better job at presenting the ominous threat of the Cordyceps than the first episode's cold open, and in a way that actually feels relevant. Then we get Ellie explaining to Joel and Tess how she's been infected for a while without turning, so Marlene wants to get her across the country to some doctors who might be able to develop a vaccine for the Cordyceps by studying her. In both versions of the story, Joel wants nothing to do with this, rolling his eyes at the prospect of some girl's free community doing anyone any good, insisting to Tess that they go back to the city and not risk their asses further. But Tess doesn't give in, headstrong that they do the job, the prospect of a cure seeming to hearten her a little. There's something missing here for why she's moved by this new hope. I've seen whispers online about there apparently being background for Tess involving a husband and a child who got infected, which, yeah, that explained her motive and frankly feels vitally missing here. I enjoy Tess as a companion to Joel, and seeing how quickly she softens towards Ellie is endearing, but knowing better what drives her to her decisions beyond in-the-moment whims would better complement the story. This is something the show could have corrected, maybe with a flashback explicitly showing Tess's tragic past, letting us in on her trauma without necessarily doing so for the other characters. Or just have Ellie ask her the way she asked Joel personal questions, perhaps adding more contrast between Tess and Joel by showing she's more able to discuss her painful memories, whereas Joel at this point continues to keep all that buried deep. So Tess urges them forward, and the trek through ruined Boston that follows gives us our best look yet into how the Cordyceps have permeated this world. For the game, this is where we first start being set against intimidating amounts of infected, including The Last of Us' best contribution to zombie horror canon, the Clickers. What a triumph of design these guys are, their horrific, shambling bodies bursting with fungus and fury. Their sound design is beyond unnerving, from the inhuman clicks of their namesake to that god-awful shriek they give off when they go aggro. In all my years gaming, few things managed to stop my heart like the sight of one of these things flailing their arms with wild abandon as they lurch towards me. Joel can beat down regular infected till the cows come home, but let a clicker get within arm's reach of you and it's game over, meaning no matter how well equipped you are, you can never discount the tremendous danger they pose. Much about the clickers is preserved in the show, the principal difference simply being how few of them we actually see, which can be said of all the infected in the show, really. Episode 2, appropriately titled Infected, is where the bulk of the show's infected content takes place, and it doesn't amount to a whole lot. I'm far from the first person to note this. The minimal presence of zombies in the show set in a zombie apocalypse has been a point of contention amongst fans. What irritates me in these discussions is how often people will reduce the desire for more infected to some lowbrow desire to see action and gore, saying because the show is really about human relationships, that such stuff would only be filler, which is such an unimaginative perspective. The infected are so much more than cheap horror set dressing. They're symbolically significant. The terror of their presence, their ceaseless aggression, what we see done to the human body under the Cordyceps influence, all this contributes to the world's existential atrophy, to the diminishment of the human condition into animalistic bloodshed. Yet certain pretentious fans seem annoyed whenever they're reminded that their prestigious show has zombies in it, as if that takes something away from the story's exploration of nuanced human struggles rather than being central to informing them. All that said, the show has a right to go about things its own way, and as far as the reduction of infected go, it can at least be said to have the effect of making them appear more individually dangerous, since nary an encounter with them takes place without someone getting bit. There's validity to a less is more approach, but I think the broader critique behind people's disappointment with the lack of infected is a sense that the show doesn't come close to capturing the hostility of the game's world. Not that Joel and Ellie have it easy in the show, but the difference is palpable. The pair in the game hardly able to cross the street without having to kill for the privilege. Again though, the response to this I kept seeing was that action would just be boring to watch, that there's no need for it now that The Last of Us is no longer a game. Shockingly, even the creators of the show seem to subscribe to this thinking, speaking in a behind-the-scenes video on how the violence of the games were basically a puzzle, purely mechanical, and therefore redundant when retelling the story. It's kind of baffling to listen to Craig Mazin say this while sitting right next to Neil Druckmann. Like, come on, Neil, do you really think that's a fair assessment of what the action gameplay conveys about character, story, and atmosphere in the game you wrote? Do I need to remind you of the sequel to that game you also wrote and directed, where these ideas were even more thoroughly explored? Neil, I know you like to make games that are basically TV shows, but they are still games. Give you and your team some credit, man. Okay, I'm mostly kidding, but still, I can't help but feel Craig's words here are dismissive of what the game accomplishes, though it certainly explains why the show seems to dismiss action as a necessary element of its storytelling. Maybe it comes down to a lack of confidence in being able to make action scenes that are engaging without inherently romanticizing the violence, which I can understand, but there are ways to do this. The film Green Room comes to mind, having some of the grittiest and most visceral violence of any movie I've ever seen, and delivering it all in an utterly pulse-pounding way, all while treating it with appropriate horror. The game's approach to all this was, well, not to really bother, and to just let the violence be as casual an element of the world as anything else. And yeah, that may not have translated well between mediums. Still though, with how essential Joel and Ellie's need to fight for their lives is to the game, it just feels like the show ought to have tried harder to capture this element of its source material, instead feeling like it does the bare minimum, the only action that takes place pretty much being what takes place in the game's cutscenes. While it's probably clear what I personally think of this choice, I'm not about to dismiss the show entirely for it, even if I do feel that something core to The Last of Us identity disappears with it. And without spoiling anything, it really makes me wonder how they're going to pull off part 2, cause yeah. Other than quantity and their little mouth tendrils, I guess, the only other big change the show makes with the infected is a new, kind of hilariously video gamey mechanic where the Cordyceps share something akin to a fungi hive mind. Thus they're able to communicate and swarm when the writers want them to. I mean, when the prey is detected on the fungal network or something. Well, geez, it's no wonder they didn't want to add more infected to the show now. This mechanic makes writing any interaction with them a logistical nightmare, since you can no longer just have a quick encounter with some runners without having to justify them not calling in the cavalry. So yeah, another change I'm not a big fan of. Other than giving the writers an easy bring in zombies button, which already feels counterproductive to the show's otherwise minimalist approach to representing the infected, it otherwise serves to give the Cordyceps some means of saturating the environments, since the show drops the spore mechanic from the game. even though that was far less contrived and led to some really creepy, nightmarish interior environments. But that's just a gimme, really, since it would mean putting Pedro Pascal's handsome mug behind a mask, and I imagine after The Mandalorian, he's made sure to put in his contracts that that can never happen. Both versions of our story see our heroes arrive too late to the Capitol building, the Fireflies waiting for them already dead. Joel, of course, is ready to call it quits, only for Tess to reveal she'd been bit in their last run-in with Infected. As either Fedra or the aforementioned infected horde swoop in, Tess begs that Joel follow through with Ellie, get her to the Fireflies no matter what. Joel, holding back his heartbreak, flees with Ellie. Tess's last stand against Fedra and the ensuing escape sequence work great in the game, a real shit-hitting-the-fan moment, putting you up against more human enemies than previously, and demanding you get used to not having Tess by your side to pick up your slack. The show's swarm scene... Gosh, I really feel like I've been hitting on the show hard these last few minutes, and I promise that's about to stop for a while, but can we all agree that Tess letting an infected Frencher is the dumbest fucking moment in any version of The Last of Us? What on God's fungal earth were they thinking with this I Am Legend bullshit? All it accomplishes is robbing Tess of her dignity in her final moments, and why the show felt the need to do that, I cannot fathom. Yet God forbid the show have more action, wouldn't want it to be tasteless or anything. Okay, I've gotten my harshest words out, and I'm happy to say we're on to Billstown, a highlight of both the game and show. When episode 3 of the show, Long Time, aired, it was met with massive acclaim, considered by many to be masterful in how it adapts the game's story for the new medium. I also liked the episode, but it feels wrong to call it an exceptional example of adaptation. To be that, it would have to actually be trying to recreate the original, at least in spirit, and the show's version of Billtown is just fundamentally different from the game's, not merely in execution of detail, but in substance. It is, at best, inspired by the game, taking characters and ideas from this section of the story and recontextualizing them to such a degree that we get a new story altogether. To be perfectly clear, this is fine and even good, but to praise Long Time on the basis of its success as an adaptation, I feel is to do both it and its apparent source material a disservice, as it ignores that the different versions of Billstown serve entirely different purposes, and should instead be evaluated as such. I don't think the game's version of Billstown was inherently unadaptable, but given the show's already discussed sensibilities towards action and violence, it would have needed major retooling. It's one of the most infected, dense sections of the game, demanding the player use everything at their disposal to overcome the enemy's overwhelming presence. So rather than try and make a less combat-heavy version of this work, the writers went in an entirely different direction, one that largely omits Ellie and Joel for the sake of developing a completely new relationship. And yeah, Bill and Frank aren't new characters, but if they ever once resembled the relationship we see in the show, then we certainly don't see it in the game. Heck, one of the only things we know about Game Frank is that he died hating Bill. So yeah, the differences here are vast, meaning I can't so easily jump between versions of the story. They simply don't run parallel enough for that to make sense, so I'll be focusing on Billstown one adaptation at a time, starting with the game. Joel knows Bill as a scavenger who mostly dealt with Tess, but he lives nearby and Joel figures if anyone has a car, Bill does. Joel's met Bill, but never where he lives, so Joel's not entirely sure what to expect. But he and Ellie are barely alley deep into the area before seeing a clicker stumble through one of Bill's traps. Billstown isn't a fortress, it's a suburb-spanning labyrinth of blockades and tripwires designed to manage the infected rather than keep them out. A deliberate strategy Bill employs, as nothing deters raiders like a neighborhood crowded with clickers. It doesn't take long for Joel to stumble into one of Bill's traps himself, leaving him hanging upside down. As if the heavy weapon sway the game adds to the aiming weren't enough, trying to keep Ellie covered while dangling by her ankle makes for a disorienting challenge, the game for once giving you ample ammunition so as to shift your focus to speed rather than precision. Once cut down, Joel still nearly gets chomped before Bill shows up to save the day, decapitating an infected and telling Joel to move his ass. Whatever else Bill is, he knows his way around to scrap with the infected, and from this point through the end of the chapter he'll be at Joel and Ellie's side. Once they're out of immediate danger though, Bill's paranoia turns on them. He gets on Ellie's bad side by handcuffing her, and she on his when she breaks free and smacks him with a lead pipe. Moreover, from Bill's point of view, a kid like Ellie is nothing but a burden, just something else that can drag you down, and he has no patience for burdens. He's a good contrast to Joel at this point, being way less patient and respectful of Ellie, so she, in turn, is disrespectful of him, and the two snide verbal clashes are not at all in the spirit of camaraderie. They hate each other, and it's hilarious, making Joel's demeanor with Ellie feel so much warmer in comparison. The two are able to bond over how extra Bill is, as Joel too is repeatedly harangued at by Bill for not being more like him, for not cutting other people off and looking out for himself, considering it the only rational thing to do in a world this treacherous. Despite this, Bill agrees to help Joel, seeming to owe him for some unspecified debt, but I'm not sure that's really it. With how vocally survivalistic and misanthropic Bill is, it's surprising how quickly he's on board with putting himself in direct peril for someone else's sake, even if he complains about the inconvenience of it every step of the way. Bill reminds me of people I've talked to in real life who live like shutaways and foster this hyper-paranoid view of the world, who on the surface hate other people, but get them talking and they'll go on and on and on, as if they've been starving for anyone to just hear them. Earl Brown's performance as Bill sells this so well, ceaselessly suspicious and sassy, but with an underlying sadness, his irritability projecting an inner turmoil. I don't even think Bill is aware of how lonely he is, how much the lack of human contact can drain from a person. I know I took for granted my capacity for being alone before the COVID pandemic taught me a thing or two. Humans are social animals, we're not built to be alone. But when the world is so hostile and a lot of that hostility comes from other people, we can easily convince ourselves otherwise. Bill has done just that, and if you need more proof that his talk of being above the need for others is a facade, you need only look to Frank. Frank is not a character we ever actually meet, but we find plenty of evidence of his presence in Billstown, and get the impression he and Bill were close, but had some raw feelings between them, enough so that Frank decided he couldn't take it anymore and tried to set out on his own. Some notes you can find even imply he had a plan to get into the Boston QZ, but alas it was not to be, as he never made it out of town before getting a couple bites from the neighborhood infected. So Frank took the time to write out a final note addressed to Bill, wherein he tells Bill he hated his guts and that dying was better than going on living with his paranoid, miserable ass. Contradicting Bill's whole spiel to Joel about letting the stragglers go from his life, since that seemingly was less of a choice than he made it out to be. He didn't cut Frank off. Frank left because he couldn't take Bill anymore, because the sum of Bill's paranoia and cynicism is an utterly corrosive person. So Frank bailed, and it cost him his life. He hanged himself before he could turn, getting found by us later during our own mission to get out of town. Bill is clearly affected by this sight, still making dismissive comments about how stupid Frank was and how ugly his shirt is, covering his hurt with pettiness. If you find the letter Frank wrote to Bill, you can give it to him. And you probably will on accident, because the game doesn't tell you that's what's going to happen when you press triangle here. Bill won't say much, tearing up the note and muttering to himself, a fairly reserved reaction to finding out one of the only people in your life despised you so much they spent their dying words roasting you. But hey, that kind of reaction goes to show why Frank felt the way he did. If you don't stumble into handing over the note though, I have to think that the more Joel thing to do is to keep it to yourself. Joel, after all, knows well that some truths are only good for hurting. Either way, Bill doesn't change much as we part ways with him, still spouting how Ellie almost got them killed, even though, if anything, she made things a lot easier for them by conveniently knowing well enough how to drive a car to need no explanation on how to get the dead battery running. But nope, still just a burden in Bill's eyes, because at this point the only thing keeping Bill sane is his stubborn, defensive worldview. Still, he's not a completely rotten person, having definitely put himself in harm's way for Joel's sake here, even giving him some tools for siphoning gas as a parting gesture. He clearly wants to be helpful, wants to connect, but he's too dug into a life he's insisted is the only way, a life of shunning others. So Joel and Ellie leave, Bill, funnily, being one of the few side characters in the game not to be viciously offed. I guess going on living like he does is a bad fate in itself. I have to think Joel felt this too, seeing what a cold-hearted survivalist mentality looks like in its totality, a sight which may inspire him to not shy away from his blooming connection with an immune teenage girl. So that's Billstown in the game, an action-packed romp featuring a great character who ultimately serves as a cautionary tale. Now let's move on to the show and the vastly different story it delivers. For one, the episode is bookended with Joel and Ellie scenes, some of which I'll discuss later, but the meat and potatoes of the episode is all about Bill. And Frank, though just Bill to start. We see here how Billstown came to be, the show's version anyway, as it's more of a Godfather-esque compound than the network-laden suburbs of the game. It would seem that even before the apocalypse, Bill was a survivalist, or a prepper if you prefer, as we find him days after the outbreak, hunkering in a hidden room as government soldiers search his house, gathering the townsfolk to be, unbeknownst to them, shot in a field. Bill, however, seems to have expected something like this to happen even before the zombie apocalypse, And since that's what's ended up happening, he happens to be in a pretty good position. He emerges from his house, no one in sight, and smiles. A part of Bill has always wanted everyone to just fuck off, and suddenly they went and did. He sets up his secure little square, surrounded by an electric fence and carefully monitored traps, and seems to be having a swell old time. We don't spend a ton of time with Bill in this period, though, jumping ahead 3 years when something stumbles into one of Bill's traps. Only it's not an infected, it's a dude named Frank. Frank pleads with Bill not to be killed, which Bill obliges, telling him to get lost, only for Frank to ask for food. Bill's hesitant, but he seems convinced by Frank's harmlessness and by his straightforwardness, and also probably because Bill thinks he's a hottie. He puts on the works for his unexpected guest, too, letting him shower and preparing a lovely meal by normal standards, let alone those in the end times. Frank's face when he sees the plate says it all, Murray Bartlett projecting such earnest excitement at how amazing of a situation he just stumbled into. Nick Offerman is also great as Bill, not having quite the same talkative, aggressive personality as Earl Brown's take on the character, being more gruff and stoic, and evidently not nearly as much of a prick, since he never drives Frank away. Frank ends up staying, the romantic tension between the two not taking long to passionately pour over, after which we jump ahead another few years, the two still very much together. We find them arguing about Frank wanting to restore parts of the town for purely aesthetic reasons, which Bill doesn't care for, but Frank argues it's his way of showing love, wanting to leave his mark and make this place his own. He also wants them to start making friends. This is a harder sell for Bill, who, accepting Frank, still has no interest in engaging with other people. Frank goes ahead and invites strangers into their home anyway. Not just anyone either, Joel and Tess, which, if you ask me, was unwise. But hey, it works out, and the gang has a quaint little lunch date. I get the intent in including Joel in the story, and it's not the end of their attempts to tie him in, but there's just something so corny about this scene to me. Tess and Frank, who've just met, go off whispering like besties, while the tough boys, Bill and Joel, sit back and talk biz. It establishes how they started working together, sure, but turns out there's nothing all that interesting about that. Before leaving, Joel warns Bill about the potential for raiders, which is meant to make Joel seem street smart and like he's looking out for his new bud. But Bill definitely didn't need to be told to beware people, so Joel's role in this episode's main story feels completely superfluous. Thankfully, following this, the episode maintains better focus on that core relationship between Bill and Frank, their love proving its strength again and again, never losing its tenderness. While the bones of this story could apply to a couple of any makeup, the fact that Bill and Frank are gay men feels essential to what the episode is expressing, since, in a strange sort of way, quaint moments like the pair sharing strawberries are only possible because the world ended. While it's never explicitly discussed, we can infer that Bill's antisocial attitude is a reaction to being othered by a bigoted world, being made unsafe just for being himself. So for Frank to come into his life out of nowhere, for these two to find each other despite everything, is kinda miraculous. They've finally found the safety and acceptance that the world never offered in each other, which is a pretty neat and critical counterpoint to include in a series whose depiction of the fallen world is otherwise so defined by loss and atrophy. Not everything about the old world was good, especially for folks like Bill. Before moving into Bill and Frank's final act, that raider attack Joel was nice enough to foreshadow has to happen, though it ultimately doesn't serve much of a purpose other than to give us one of the better scenes between Bill and Frank, as Frank tends to Bill's gunshot wound. Bill sternly dictating instructions for what to do after he's dead, Frank humoring his rambling without ever losing focus on saving his partner's life. It's a great addition to the episode, but Bill could have gotten hurt and led to this scene through any number of circumstances, and it should have been anything else, because the way this attack is choreographed is atrocious, and actually makes me glad the show has so few action sequences if this is how they'd be handled. We see the raiders arrive and trigger the perimeter's fire traps. Then we're with Frank in the house getting woken up by the commotion. He finds his gun and goes outside, where Bill is standing in the middle of the road taking shots at the raiders, who are on the other side of the fence either burning or just stood out in the open returning fire. I've never been in a real firefight, but do they tend to play out this way, with the shooters just dispassionately standing in place like in a turn-based RPG? So of course Bill gets shot and Frank drags him back to the house, where aforementioned scene takes place, and Bill says that the fence will take care of the rest of them, which... What? Does he think the rest of the raiders will just throw themselves on the fence like idiots? I mean, based on how they've conducted themselves so far, that's not the worst bet. But geez, It's no wonder they decided to blast this whole scene with artificial rain, because if you could actually see how goofy this all looks, it'd be impossible to take seriously. Past this silliness, though, Long Time delivers a moving conclusion to Bill and Frank's story. We jump ahead a few more years and find that Frank's health is in decline. His wits are about him, but he's bound to a wheelchair and has trouble doing much himself besides painting, needing Bill's help with pretty much everything. Bill doesn't mind for his part, but the time comes when Frank has had enough. One morning he tells Bill that today will be his last day, that they'll use it to celebrate their love, and at the end, Bill can crush some pills into his wine and let him drift off in peace. The very idea is impossible for Bill. So incomprehensible is the prospect of life without Frank, without the only person giving him a purpose. He follows Frank's instructions, though. We're given a slow, delicate montage of the two's last hours together, a series of quiet moments set to a soaring orchestral score that captures the magnitude of these characters' feelings. Then the moment comes, and Bill does as Frank asks, only with the addition that he too helps himself to a glass of euthanasia, Frank not realizing until the last drop has already been drunk. Bill tells Frank plainly that he's old, he's lived a happier life than he ever expected to, and he sees no point in going any further if he has to do it without Frank, without the man who fell into a big hole like a dope and subsequently changed his life. Frank's response is, I think, the quintessential line of the episode. I do not support this, I should be furious, but from an objective point of view, it is incredibly romantic. There is a sad quality to Bill's decision here, since he absolutely could go on living. Not to mention, throwing away the rest of your life in a world where so many have been denied full lives is undeniably kind of selfish. Frank's a thoughtful and compassionate person. He's aware of this and, like he says, should be upset. But it's showing such little regard for these concerns that makes what Bill does romantic, as he shows he doesn't need life, he needs Frank. That isn't wrong in and of itself, and it's worth noting that plenty of others who are much better positioned to speak on it have written at length on how Bill and Frank's deaths are an admirable subversion of typical gay romance tropes for how it preserves their agency rather than seeing them ripped apart. Something you could certainly argue the game was guilty of, especially when you take the fate of Ellie and Riley into account and realize they kinda killed their gays twice in one game. However, to best understand how Bill and Frank's new story fits into The Last of Us, I don't think we can ignore the parallels between Bill's choice and Joel's choice at the end of the season to save Ellie and kill the Fireflies. Now, obviously, the potential consequences of that choice concern the whole of mankind, where Bill's doesn't, but there is a connection between these actions, taken as they were by men driven solely by their love for someone else, taken without due consideration of that person's feelings, and doing what many would consider the wrong thing. But right and wrong aren't really Bill and Joel's concern. They care only about what they love, and while there's undeniably a wholesome quality to that love, it does not produce good holistically. As we will see plainly with Joel, sometimes love is the justification for ugly, awful things, especially in the zero-sum world of the post-apocalypse, and people's willingness to embrace that ugliness for the people they love is one of the core pillars of The Last of Us. With Bill's choice to die with Frank, however, the show gives us a largely positive vision of this kind of devotion, presenting the idea of love coming before life in a beautifully human way before the rest of the show will go on to complicate these notions. Beyond the perimeter of Bill's electric fence, the world rages, but inside, things are simple, and in that simplicity is guiltless bliss. If only the same could be true everywhere. So, there you have it, the full duality of Billstown, two distinct side stories within the same main narrative, one a tale of love and the other a tale of loneliness. I like what both bring to the story for different reasons, even if in succeeding as they do, they kind of highlight the other's deficiencies. I think the game's message would have hit much harder had we gotten more of Frank, a better sense of whom he was besides just the guy who left Bill. These games are full of notes and letters that give context to the world Joel and Ellie wouldn't otherwise intuit, so maybe more such content written by Frank besides his hateful farewell would have improved that letter's impact. As for the show, funnily enough, it's actually a conveniently written letter tying things up that signifies the problem. Bill's letter to Joel is so transparently meant to inspire him, to influence his character in a narratively meaningful way by invoking his identity as a protector, and the episode just didn't need this at all. I think the thematic connection to Joel and Ellie's arc I've already elaborated are strong enough, And the way the episode's ending is framed, with Joel and Ellie taking Bill's truck and gear, listening to his and Frank's song over that wistful final shot through the window, it all gives the sense of these two carrying with them the love that thrived in this place, that so possessed the owners of these items. And that's just so much more elegant of a way to connect this otherwise unrelated story to our main character's journey than an annoyingly contrived letter. Come on, Neil, you've been doing this letter stuff since 2013 at least. You should know better by now. I think it also bears mentioning that this episode's placement in the series is awkward. Taking the focus away from Joel and Ellie to such a degree at a critical time in their relationship is an odd choice, so I wonder if we shouldn't have come back to Billstown after the Kansas City chapter, pushing Bill and Frank's story to episode 5. Joel and Ellie could still stop by the town at the start of episode 3 to get the truck and whatnot, maybe finding hints to Bill and Frank's fate that wouldn't make sense to us until we got the full story, but in the moment we move on and move away from it until a more fitting point in the season where we can leave Joel and Ellie for a while. The jump from Kansas City to Wyoming being ideal. That would just feel tidy to me, less disruptive to put the pocket episode right in the middle of the season instead of weirdly early on. And yeah, that contradicts my praising of the episode's ending, but hey, I think both things can be true. Really, there's no perfect way to transplant an entirely new chapter into the game's existing framework while changing nothing else about that framework, at least not to a comparable degree. So the fact that it works as well as it does is probably good enough. The two versions of The Last of Us come back together with our main duo driving west, though the differences in their journeys have been such that it doesn't quite feel like they're in the same place. Game Joel is generally softer towards Ellie from the get-go, but he still has a long way to go before seeing her as anything like a daughter figure. Show Joel, despite being less hardcore than his game counterpart in most regards, is actually much colder towards Ellie in the early hours of their time together, doing more to remain emotionally distant. However, Show Ellie is also more into pushing Joel's buttons, the dialogue between them written more as comedic banter, Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey's chemistry at its best when the two are playing off each other's senses of humor. Through such interactions, we see Joel's facade of indifference diminish as it becomes harder for him to tell himself he doesn't care about this girl. It makes sense for the show to be written this way, given it has to be much more deliberate with the limited time it has, not afforded the same space that the game's pacing allows for the two to develop a rapport based on casual exchanges made during traversal. The same thinking applies to the differences in how each version explores Ellie's developing relationship with violence. Game Ellie starts at a place where violence against people still disturbs her, though violence against the infected is just business, sometimes even satisfying business. Once the principal threat to her and Joel shifts from infected to hunters, she quickly adapts, and is all too happy to see Joel wipe them out, though she's still likely to exclaim under her breath at the savagery with which he goes about it. Her comfort with violence develops through osmosis, her repeated exposure to brutality instilling in her the simple reality that killing is an awfully useful means of survival. Show Ellie, on the other hand, displays a kind of fascination with violence from early on. Her odd stare at Joel killing the guard in episode 1 saying a lot when compared to Game Ellie's more distressed reaction. She asks Joel about killing in episode 2 in a way that felt cliché to me at first, as did a scene early in episode 3 where she finds a pinned infected and kills it, seeming to treat the deed like some tough guy rite of passage or something. However, we eventually learn that Ellie has killed an infected before this, too, actually, with Riley, and so these scenes gain new nuance, as we realize it's Ellie's reconciling with the violence she's already been forced to commit, coming to terms with the need to kill, and perhaps finding a strange sort of strength in it. Both versions of Ellie are put in the position of having to kill to save Joel, if in notably different fashions. In the game, it all happens very fast, Ellie popping the hunter in the head and killing him instantly. "I shot the shit out of that guy, huh?" she says, almost in disbelief at how easy it was. She's clearly distraught, but Joel doesn't handle it well. He too is a bit shaken by almost getting killed in a QuickTime event, and he takes it out on her, chastising her for having a gun when he'd forbade it. Ellie, for her part, doesn't take this shit and tells him off, saying it was either him or the other guy, and she did what she had to. After some sulking, Joel eventually acknowledges his fault and trusts Ellie to use a gun when he's in a bind, the kind of acknowledgement of her maturity and capability that Ellie's been looking for. The show eventually reaches this same point, but the killing is a lot messier. The guy Ellie shoots doesn't die outright, but is paralyzed, so of course he starts panicking and begging for his life, even delusionally bargaining by trying to give them his knife. Ellie's speechless at having done this to someone, Joel not saying anything, his expression pained at what has to be done. He tells Ellie to step away and we stick with her, not seeing as Joel finishes the kid off. With the knife he was bargaining with too by the sound of it, sheesh. Ellie wipes away her tears before Joel can see them, but Joel knows better. He certainly handles the situation more maturely than Game Joel, telling Ellie she shouldn't have had to do what she did. But there's no erasing that kid's cries for his mom. We get a better sense here of Joel feeling he's failed to protect Ellie, not merely from direct harm, but from having to engage with the violence of the world in the way he does, not wanting to put that burden on her. Though he still gives her the gun, understanding that the rest of the world has no interest in preserving her innocence, so for him to do so would be doing her a disservice. All this is prompted by the duo venturing deep into the urban territory of a hostile group, though which city and the nature of that group is yet another point where the series notably deviate. The locational change is mostly superficial, the game having Joel and Ellie ambushed in Pittsburgh while the show has them make it all the way to Kansas City, which is a change I mostly appreciate because it means that for a few pages I can say Pittsburgh and Kansas City instead of game and show. As to the people occupying these cities, they both come to represent the wickedness man is capable of in the absence of any meaningful authority, if in ways that differ in execution and substance. Pittsburgh is under the thumb of a massive gang of scumbags, united by their shared survival of the fittest mentality, all of them agreeing that they are the fittest, and are entitled to take whatever they want from whoever they can. Joel and Ellie stumble into an elaborate ambush designed to overwhelm anyone passing through the city, and the evidence suggests that this has been working well for the hunters. They've been at this for a while. Pittsburgh's government long ran out of town, the circumstances of which are elaborated through in-game letters, the most significant of which I found suggesting that the Fireflies had a lot to do with the initial uprising's success, only for another group to decide that the Fireflies are boring and that they'd profit much more from turning Pittsburgh into their personal feeding trough. Really though, the context of these hunters' control matters less than the threat they pose, their commitment to taking by force representing a truly ugly vision of humanity, one which we can fight against mostly guilt-free, since Lord knows these guys wouldn't afford us the same mercy. Surviving Pittsburgh demands brutality. It demands we kill just as ruthlessly as the enemy would, even as the game continues to reinforce that these guys are still human. They chat with each other, worry about things, get irritated by the mundanities of their day-to-day, struggle for life as Joel chokes them out. You know, human things. Still, it says a lot that the closest thing to a character we get out of this group isn't a person at all. It's a truck, and a real mean one at that. The truck pops up a handful of times to make Joel and Ellie's lives more difficult. Since it can't be punched or shot to death, you have no choice but to run and hide from it, and it goes to some lengths to chase you. It's the prized weapon of the Pittsburgh Hunters, their ultimate one-up on anyone who might challenge them, and they take sadistic pleasure in the threat it represents, which makes finally setting the insides of it on fire both satisfying and relieving. Funny enough, at that point you're well away from the downtown area the Hunters control. They could have just left well enough alone and kept their truck and the 20-odd guys that Joel kills in the same fight, but I guess Joel did a bit too much damage on his way through town for that to sit right with them. Sounds like there's a lesson there, doesn't it? The Kansas City version of events certainly seems to think so, as it depicts the Hunters as more directly driven by vengeful bloodlust, and is far more overt in its efforts to characterize the group than Pittsburgh was. Rather than that city's long overrun QZ, Joel and Ellie come to KC mere days after Fedra's control was ripped from its grasp by an organized uprising, the new ruling gang's first priority evidently being punishment. Episode 5 starts with a stark depiction of mob justice, Fedra soldiers being tortured, humiliated, and killed en masse in the streets. Joel eventually has a line saying that even he had heard about the brutality of Kansas City's Fedra, so we can assume this outburst wasn't exactly unprovoked, but the horror of the violence is undeniable, and it's instilled in the rebellion a taste for blood that is yet to be sated when Joel and Ellie fall into their trap. Heck, the very fact that these guys come for Joel and Ellie at all goes to show how trigger-happy they are. Like, why did they even have this ambush set up? Because after the thugs there are killed, they act like they've been invaded by aggressors rather than people whom they tried to rob and murder. Maybe that's the point, that the rebels' whole pursuit of justice is just pretense for asserting violent control, or maybe the writers just wanted to keep the cool ambush scene without thinking about how the new content doesn't fit it as well. Regardless, Joel and Ellie become their enemies, and as The Last of Us knows quite well, what defines those bounds is often sadly arbitrary. The search for the remaining Fedra collaborators is spearheaded by a new character for the show, Kathleen, the rebellion's leader who has a personal vendetta with one collaborator in particular whom she's seemingly ignoring all other responsibilities to track down. We spend a fair bit of time with Kathleen across Casey's 2-episode arc, and I don't think it's especially controversial to say it's one of the show's weakest elements. I don't want to blame Melanie Lynskey, since I know from Yellow Jackets that she's talented enough to sell a despicable yet compelling character, but Kathleen is just basic and boring. Watching her smugly lord over people whose lives are in her hand is neither interesting or intimidating. It's just stereotypical villain posturing. She never acts like a morally ambiguous person. She's just evil and mean. There's a scene with her and the guy who played Tommy in the game, which seems to frame her character not as a result of what she's endured and lost, but just as an inherent part of her. "My brother was beautiful," she says, referring contextually to his compassion and desire to see the good in people, before following with, "I'm not. I never was." There you have it, folks. Kathleen's not a tragic figure who's lost sight of the value of human life, she's just always been kind of an asshole. Villains can just be evil, sure. A few episodes down the line, we get a pretty good villain who is pretty much just an evil bastard. But if that's how they're going to be written, then they have to at least do interesting things, be intimidating, something. But all Kathleen can do is eat up screen time. She's just too flat of a character to do anything else, somehow a less nuanced antagonist than the scary truck in Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, all the time the 2 episodes spend in Kansas City dedicated to Kathleen means there's not much room to develop the larger group beyond being extensions of Kathleen's own obsession with vengeance. Also, despite being far better equipped than their game counterparts, they've got a whole convoy of trucks instead of just the one, they somehow come off less threatening, Joel and Ellie making it through the city with pretty much no trouble at all, the oppressive sense of being stranded and hunted through Pittsburgh getting almost completely lost. I'll grant it's not a terrible idea to rein in the game's persistent bouts of combat in favor of producing one large explosive sequence, but Kathleen and company's last stand against the swarm of infected just didn't land for me. The infected bursting out of the ground like the locust from Gears of War is ludicrous. I mean, it was one thing to give them this ability to communicate through the fungus, concentrating to particular locations, but this is some next level cartoon shit, producing a spectacle so chaotic it's hard to even give the characters credit for surviving. Lucky for every moment they're not trampled by the army of infected who've turned up. And sure, that might be the intent, but combined with all the different contrivances that the scene is already built on, and I can't help but feel totally disconnected from the show's reality here. I guess seeing the bloater was cool, but given that we never see one again, it sort of just amounts to an expensive reference. You know, after setting it up here, it might have been cool to see Joel and Ellie contend with one of these things at some point, since the one here just goes straight for Kathleen. Maybe he was just trying to do us a favor. Also, on a similar note, I feel the need to point out that this scene is also a wrap on clickers for the season, and excepting 2 scenes that take place in flashbacks, this is the last we see of any infected in the show whatsoever. Joel and Ellie don't encounter any more infected in the show, and we still have 4 episodes to go. I've belabored this point plenty already, but let that sink in a bit and then tell me you still think Neil and Craig aren't zombie-hating criminals. Alright, silliness aside, I'll admit I've been awfully critical of the Kansas City portion of the show, but I'm happy to report that it at least does one thing very well, and in some ways even better than the game, and that's how it handles Sam and Henry. I like them in the game too, but the show's new context connecting Henry to the events of the KC Revolt draw a finer parallel with the series' larger themes, once again tapping into the idea of what we're willing to do for those we love, though here we see the show beginning to problematize the simple and sweet vision of this concept we first got with Bill and Frank. Henry seemingly was close to the Resistance at first, close enough to have info on their first leader, Kathleen's brother. When Sam became sick with leukemia, the only way for Henry to get the treatment his brother needed was by giving that leader up to Fedra, an event which led to the man's death, Kathleen's takeover of the rebellion, and the violent results that followed. Henry's clearly got guilt about this, telling Joel, "I'm the bad guy because I did the bad guy thing," not rejecting the reality of his betrayal or its consequences, but nevertheless steadfast in his decision that looking out for Sam was the right priority, no matter what it cost. He doesn't feel the need to justify himself, knowing on some level that he can't, but in Joel he seems to find some understanding. We continue to get more vulnerability from Show Joel, connecting to Henry on a more emotional level, despite the 2 actually having more contrasted personalities than in the game, making the trajectory of this arc feel all the more tragic. Show Sam is 8 years old and deaf, meaning he's very much dependent on Henry, who has a warm and fatherly disposition towards him. Contrastingly, Game Sam isn't deaf and is closer to Ellie's age, which leads to a bit more brotherly friction, such as when Henry chastises Sam for packing a toy when they have to be frugal about what they carry, and otherwise discouraging him from childish distractions, not necessarily appreciating his brother's innocence the way a parent might, or the way he does in the show. Sam being much younger than Ellie changes their dynamic as well, he looking at her like the cool older kid rather than a peer, which makes their final scene together particularly interesting to compare. After barely scraping by earlier in the day, Ellie and Sam are getting ready to turn in for the night when they get to talking, Ellie feeling that Sam is upset somehow. In the show, Sam starts asking her questions, particularly about what she's afraid of, prompting Ellie to get more open with him, and he in turn with her, by showing her the bite he has on his shin. He's too young to fully grasp what's happened to him, whereas Ellie is so desperate to do something that she deludes herself into believing he can be helped. Her first instinct is to comfort, to save, resorting to the childish logic that if she rubs some of her immune blood into his bite, that should do the trick. Sam, being young and fully trusting of Ellie, seems relieved, and Ellie, once more, decides to wait out a bite, hoping for the best. It's all incredibly foolish, no doubt, but such is her desperation. So frightened is she of losing this kid who she's just gotten close to. Of course, it doesn't work. The way infected Sam just sits on the bed staring at the wall until Ellie walks into his field of view, probably being the best horror moment of the season. In the game, Sam never reveals his bite to Ellie. Instead, their talk about what they fear goes deeper, the two pondering if there's anything left of a person after they become infected, if they go on to heaven, if heaven's even real. Both are honest with each other and say they don't think it is. Then Ellie pulls out the same toy Henry made Sam throw away earlier, telling Sam he should be allowed to enjoy himself, then leaving him for the night. Sam takes one look at the toy and drops it on the ground, lifting his pant leg to reveal his bite. He never tells Ellie, or anyone, context clues making it clear that Henry's tough love has left him feeling ashamed of himself. He throws down the toy because he's frustrated for still having that childish side, for not growing up fast enough to avoid being killed, blaming himself for getting bit. It's such a brief moment, but it remains one of the game's darkest. No music, no one else there to react, just a kid sitting alone in a room, knowing he's going to die, too ashamed to say goodbye to his brother in the next room. Come the morning, Sam's full-on infected and attacks Ellie. Henry gets a grip on his gun before Joel and almost shoots him to keep him from intervening, before suddenly shooting Sam himself. It all happens so fast, so jarringly, that it takes Henry a moment to process what he's done. This hits hard in both adaptations, each performer for Henry delivering a distinctly heartbreaking reaction to what's just happened. Game Henry falling apart into a sobbing mess as he shouts blame at Joel. Show Henry only able to say, "What have I done?" while staring blankly at his brother's body. Joel tries to calm Henry down, but it's too late, as he puts the gun to his head and pulls the trigger. I love the editing of the cutscene in the game, hanging for a beat on Joel's devastated face before the stark cut to black. This would be a bit abrasive of a way for the show to end an episode though, so it decides to hang around for some of the aftermath, if only to show how little Ellie and Joel have to say, since what could anyone say to make this any better? They've still got a long way to Wyoming, and their journey has already well acquainted them with pain. The sucker punch of Sam and Henry's fate a particularly raw exclamation point, the kind whose scars don't necessarily heal with time. Time we get though, as from here we jump ahead a few months to when Joel and Ellie finally reach their destination in Wyoming. In the game, we're brought from the shock of Henry's suicide straight to a calm autumn hike, setting a quieter scene that gives the last chapter's events space to sink in. Sam and Henry only come up if you happen down a path with a sadly small grave, which gets Ellie talking about Sam, but Joel tells her to drop it. Joel follows a strict no grieving policy, seeing it as nothing but wallowing, believing that one is best served by putting whatever they've lost behind them and looking forward. There's a grain of truth to that, sure, but the degree to which Joel neglects his own grief is something we've had emphasized for us since the early hours of the game. After Tess's death, Joel tells Ellie adamantly that they're not going to talk about Tess, ever. And he even refrains from telling Bill that Tess is dead when he asks about her, even though this leads to Bill constantly bringing her up and upsetting Joel, but that's apparently easier for him than telling Bill the truth and forcing that grief out into the open. Show Joel definitely shares this aversion to grief, even if he's not as tight-lipped about his feelings. He still keeps the most personal of his traumas to himself, and his anxiety over his feelings for Ellie still compel him to distance himself when he sees the opportunity come to do so. The burden of grief has just become unbearable for Joel, holding too much pain within him already, pain he knows he'll never be able to silence. The flip side of this is that Joel seemingly can't help but care for people. He was obviously very close with Tess, and he must have at least started to care for Sam and Henry given his invitation for them to tag along in their search for the Fireflies. And, of course, there's Ellie, a girl Joel initially wanted nothing to do with, but whom he has come to respect and enjoy, his sense of purpose well fulfilled by helping her with this otherwise impossible task. Approaching the town of Jackson, though, Joel's already got an exit plan in mind. The undeniable feelings he's developed for Ellie, bringing the grief he tries so hard to ignore too close to the surface. So much does his growing love for this girl resemble how he once felt for another who died close to her age. And for Joel, that's just out of the question. This is all brought to a head when the two finally reach Tommy and his surprisingly well-adjusted little settlement. This portion of the game is kept fairly tight, getting to the point of what this section needs to accomplish character-wise and not sticking around to take in much of the sights. We never actually enter Jackson in the first game, only ever looking down at it from afar. It's promise out of reach for our characters until their job is done. The show, on the other hand, gives us a much fuller view of life in Jackson, spending the better part of the episode in the relative safety of its walls and doing much more with characters that the game only scratched the surface of. In both cases, the civility of Jackson is a breath of fresh air, a break from the cynicism that has so far seen every human endeavor made in this world either fail or degenerate into a destructive force. Jackson is a community we can comfortably call the good guys, if only because they don't actively seek out violence against people like every other group we've met so far, and seem invested in remaining peacefully self-sustaining. The show elaborates on the town's culture in a way that makes it clear it's an accepting and progressively minded place. It's nice to see, even if examining Jackson's portrayal of these ideas more closely makes me doubt some of its sincerity. There's an exchange of dialogue that was reposted in praise on one of The Last of Us' largest subreddits, and it became one of that sub's top posts, the scene being the part where Tommy is explaining that they practice collective ownership. Joel responds by saying, "So, communism?" Which Tommy rejects outright, only for Maria to point out that they are essentially communists, which seems to stop Tommy in his tracks as his brain actually does the math. It's funny, admittedly, Tommy, the red-blooded American he is, being so conditioned against communism as to not see that it's the very system he's so happily embracing. But I can't help but cringe at the poster calling this a groundbreaking thing for a popular TV show to say, seemingly ignorant of how this compliment to leftist ideas is actually quite backhanded, couched as it is in the assumption that the world no longer exists as it does in reality. The implication of Jackson's success is that these ideas are good in the context of society having already collapsed, in the wake of which relatively small communities could find success adhering to leftist principles like democratic organization and collective ownership, sure, but should our current, not quite collapsed society consider such ideas? Of course not, Joel says to Ellie later. How they do it in Jackson would never work on a larger scale. Now, you might say that's just Joel's opinion, and it is just a single line of dialogue, hardly fair to call it the show's political manifesto, but when it's also the start and end of any attempts to engage with the ideologies being gestured to in these scenes in a critical capacity, we're not exactly invited to challenge Joel's conclusions. Now, comrades, contrary to how it may sound right now, I'm not actually a very good communist myself, and I don't think that this show or any show has some obligation to advocate for leftist ideas. But let's not kid ourselves that this is some epic woke moment or something. It's a joke. The kind of toothless thumbs up to socialism executives at Sony and Warner Brothers would approve of. The kind that assures us that yes, leftism exists, and it can be nice to think about, but only ever as a fantasy. A utopian ideal only made tenable in the aftermath of unthinkable calamity, and therefore better off ignored. It is a pretty good joke at least. Reeling in that rant and bringing it back around to character, Tommy's newfound commitment to Jackson, evident in his pride for the town and marriage to Maria, has a kind of weird effect on Joel. He's expressed to Ellie before that he considers Tommy a bit of a flake, jumping from one cause to the next as his whims change, never really building anything for himself as a result. It's hard to say how fair of an assessment that is, but as we find him, Tommy clearly doesn't fit that mold, and so Joel is less able to tell him how it's going to be than he used to. Game Joel seemed to be planning on passing Ellie off on Tommy, the logic being he'd be better able to get her to the Fireflies on his own. Joel seems to expect that the big picture mentality that once drew Tommy to the Fireflies would compel him to take the cure for mankind off his hands, but Tommy's concerns are smaller than that now. He isn't going to leave Jackson and his wife on the chance that one person's immunity might be reproducible, not when he has so much to lose. This is true in the show as well, though it also conveys a greater sense of hurt from Joel over the fact that Tommy has so successfully moved on with his life without him. Recall that in the show, it was established that they'd been in radio contact for some time after separating, Joel wanting to travel here because he worried about Tommy after losing touch with him. So to find out the reason his brother stopped responding was basically because he'd started a new life and keeping in touch with his older brother was inconvenient for that, probably stings a little. Part of this comes down to what happened in those vague years between that hill in Texas and the Boston QZ, when we're told Joel was engaged in the kind of activity he and Ellie contended with aplenty in Pittsburgh. Tommy still holds some resentment towards Joel for the scars those years left on his conscience, and Joel doesn't take kindly to his brother judging him for doing what he saw as necessary for the both of them. The show's expansion on Maria's character mostly amounts to her being suspicious of Joel, cautious about letting a former raider into her town, and what his intentions with this young girl are. And with what we can infer about Joel's past actions, that's probably not unwarranted. We may feel we know Joel well enough at this point to find Maria's skepticism a bit hostile, but she's not incorrect to see him as the kind of man Jackson should be afraid of, as he's not altogether that different than the marauders who nip at the settlement's edges. In the game, an attack from these marauders interrupts Joel and Tommy's argument, a quick tussle seeming to reawaken enough camaraderie between them to settle their beef. Not the best narrative work from the game, but it gets the job done. The show, in keeping with its efforts to portray a more open Joel and evidently Tommy as well, has the two talk it out. Joel actually breaks down in front of Tommy as he relays the intensity of his fear over failing to protect Ellie. "I'm failing in my sleep," he sobs, Pedro Pascal melting Joel back down to the man who stared desperately into the eyes of a dead girl 20 years ago. It's hard not to also think about all those graphic death scenes we suffer when we fail in the game, a repeated, brutal reminder of how close these characters are at any point from suffering a terrible fate. It's this vulnerability that convinces Show Tommy to help his brother, agreeing to escort Ellie to the Fireflies on his own. Perhaps a part of him too is still on that hill, looking at his brother cradling his niece, and he can clearly pick up on the parallels with Ellie, so maybe he wants to do what he couldn't before in sparing his brother pain. Tommy and Joel are a great pair in the game. There's an understated realism to how they interact, but the show's portrayal is without a doubt much richer. Pascal and Gabriel Luna bringing enough emotional depth to the relationship to sell the complicated motivations driving this chapter of the story. The show also benefits from better highlighting how Ellie is reacting to all this, such as how seeing Joel and Tommy together seems to immediately provoke insecurity in her. She can feel Joel pulling away, and is reticent to even be separated from him while they're in Jackson. When Maria suggests Joel is an unsafe person to trust, Ellie snaps at her, not interested in hearing someone who doesn't really know Joel tell her how she should feel about him, a defensively anxious response clearly informed by the attachment she's formed with him. She also accidentally learns about Sarah from Maria. It's a nicely meek moment rather than a melodramatic revelation, Ellie knowing better than to jump into questions, processing for herself how this fits her understanding of Joel. This, on top of her picking up on Joel gravitating away from her, leads to the two's most fiery confrontation. In the game, this is prompted when Ellie steals one of Jackson's horses and rides off into the woods, Joel and Tommy tracking her down to a ranch house. It's an immature moment for her, but it's imitative of Joel's own thoughtlessness in seeking to leave her. She brings up Sarah, and the tone of the conversation immediately darkens, Joel telling Ellie to tread no further, but she's not through with him.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
Joel's been so caught up in his own fear and feelings that he's neglected to realize how much Ellie needs him. Not just as the guy who protects her, but as the closest person she has in her life. Joel doesn't react to this well, saying rather cruelly to Ellie that she is not his daughter, he's not her dad, and they're going their separate ways. The kind of cold toxicity employed by a person so overwhelmed by their own feelings that they defensively attempt to burn the bridge between themselves and the person who provoked them. Sitting with it for a while though, Joel realizes his error, that as much as his instinct may be to spare his own feelings, it's just not in him to hurt Ellie, and to leave her now after all they've been through would do only that. It's a cute scene in the game, Joel telling Ellie to get off her horse and hop up with him. There's a warmth and relief to Joel's tone, like he's finally let go of the burden of stifling his own feelings, finally opening himself up to caring for Ellie like his heart wants him to. Show Joel approaches more sheepishly, only for Ellie to brush past him. There's no need for apologies, she knew he'd come around. Leaving Jackson, Joel and Ellie are closer than they've ever been before, their bond assured by their trust in one another. A trust that, by the time they return to Jackson months later, will be forever compromised. Following Jackson is a brief foray through the University of Eastern Colorado in search of the Fireflies, who, of course, are no longer around. It's a fairly utilitarian section of the story for both the game and show, Joel and Ellie running into yet another hostile group resulting in Joel being wounded. The show has this happen as the two are basically already out of reach, but the game makes much more of a scene of it, Joel's injury happening unexpectedly in the middle of combat. It's more than slumping over the horse and riding off. Ellie has to help Joel unimpale himself and limp through the building to safety, all while fending off more enemies. Ellie has been lending a hand in combat for a while now, but with Joel all but out of commission, she's forced to take the lead, killing a handful of the hunters herself in bursts of anxious but practiced gunfire. The proximity of such graphic violence to a 14-year-old has always been an inherently uncomfortable element of the story, but it reaches new heights once that 14-year-old is the one dishing out the violence, and she's only just getting started. The next episode of the show is titled Left Behind, the chapter of the game it adapts being the downloadable content of the same name, which was released about 8 months after the main game and accessed separately. I was honestly surprised to learn that the most recent release of the game for PlayStation 5 and PC, now dubbed Part 1 and staking to be the most complete version of the game, comes with Left Behind built in, yet still keeps it a separate experience, the game strongly suggesting you finish the main story before engaging with it, even though the events of the current timeline in Left Behind belong at this point in the story. I suppose the intent is to preserve the ambiguity of Joel's survival until Ellie finally goes back to him after meeting David, but I have to wonder if this element is worth preserving when it costs everything that Left Behind has to offer, which, in terms of developing Ellie's character, is absolutely essential, and it feels strange to deliberately leave it off until after the game's conclusion. The show understands this, and following in its footsteps, we'll be jumping from the game's main story to the DLC, which fits perfectly into this episode's framework. The bulk of Left Behind centers around Ellie and Riley, but the game also has a healthy helping of general gameplay. The big difference from the main game being that we've switched to Ellie's perspective, controlling her with almost the exact same mechanical tuning as Joel. This would be true even if we were to have stuck to the main game at this point in the story, and how that transition works to sell Ellie's growth as a survivor applies in both cases, as we're shown through gameplay that Ellie is just as capable as Joel at holding her own against this world's aggressions. Well, okay, she's a bit more vulnerable in melee combat. She is a teenage girl going toe-to-toe with adults after all, but in matters of gunplay, in maneuvering a battlefield, in utilizing every resource at her disposal, in being able to muster the sheer brutality required to come out on top in these bouts, in these matters, Ellie has become every bit Joel's equal. Games play with this kind of changing perspective all the time, though you'll often see them change mechanics so as to better articulate the experience of different characters. It wouldn't have been surprising to see Naughty Dog do something like this, more severely disempowering the player as Ellie to communicate her vulnerability, quite like it did with Sarah in the prologue. In not doing this though, they characterize Ellie in the complete opposite direction. Ellie isn't just capable, she's a killing machine, having grown adept enough at violence to be fitting of the player's skills at this late point in the game. Or even better, after beating the game, if you're going by its own suggestion. It's worth noting too that the encounter design here is among the most challenging to be found in the first game. Resources slim and enemies abundant, making Ellie's triumph over these threats all the more telling of her competence, even if there's undoubtedly something disturbing to seeing someone so young having become so comfortable with stabbing the life out of people. In the early game, it was Ellie exclaiming under her breath at the brutality of what was happening before her. But when she pounces on an unsuspecting hunter with her knife, it's probably going to be you saying, "Jesus, Ellie." Considering this is all very gameplay dependent, the show is probably smart to skip most of this. Really, its inclusion in the game likely comes down to the first game's lack of confidence in putting the player in elongated narrative sequences separate from its basic loop, something that Part 2 would go on to be much more confident about doing, perhaps because of how well Left Behind was received. That's mostly on the backs of the game's writing and performances, Ellie and Riley's dynamic bringing the game's sense of humor to the forefront and creating a charming and believable friendship. The exact events of Left Behind are essentially the same between versions, the main differences being a matter of what Ellie and Riley's scenes together emphasize. The game generally takes a lighter tone, feeling more like an adventure between longtime friends, the kind who haven't hung out in a while, but as soon as they do, they pick up right where they left off. The mall isn't an unfamiliar location to the game's pair, though the electricity is a novel new addition that allows them to engage with it in fresh ways, both curious to sample as much of the old world's reality as they can, and thus the player is encouraged to soak in the colorfully detailed environments as if they were museum pieces. This is certainly a factor to the show's duo as well, but the whole endeavor is less of a shared new experience and more of a curated one, Riley going to great length to make this special for Ellie, it all being presented as a series of wonders Riley knows will impress her. There's undeniably a more overt romantic tension underlying the two's back and forth, more flirtatious teasing and longing glances. The carousel scene, for instance, an all too brief grasp of old world wonder that is the focus in the game, in the show sees Ellie far more fixated on Riley in the moment, her feelings for her trumping her fascination with the past. This isn't to say the game omits the romantic side of their connection, reaching the same point of the two sharing a kiss, but where the show feels more transparent with how it's building to this moment, the game's kiss feels spontaneous, an expression of how deep these two's bond goes that takes them both by surprise. Ellie and Riley were both raised in a Fedra orphanage. The show gives us a greater sense of how miserable of an experience this was and how Ellie struggled to connect with the other kids, except for Riley. At some point though, Riley left, without any explanation to Ellie or anyone, only to turn up in Ellie's room in the middle of the night and reveal she's joined the Fireflies. Things mostly go well, until Ellie finds out that the reason Riley wanted to hang out under such sudden circumstances is because she's leaving with the Fireflies and probably won't be coming back. Suddenly, Ellie feels abandoned all over again, and much like her future father figure, that makes her go cold, and she starts treating Riley like she stabbed her in the back somehow, when really Riley wishes that Ellie could go with her. But both adaptations make a point to say that Marlene has forbidden Ellie from joining the Fireflies, even in the show where Ellie doesn't know Marlene yet. Riley feels stuck in her commitment, passionate for the cause but dismayed at having to leave Ellie. She just wants to spend as much time with her friend as possible, and Ellie realizes that's a silly thing to be mad about. So they get back to bonding, content to enjoy what time they have. Eventually, dancing on the countertop with Riley, Ellie is overcome with a sudden desperation. She asks Riley not to go, and Riley says okay. They kiss, a moment of innocent bliss that comes crashing down hard. The arrival of the infected sours the mood pretty intensely, the game throwing a group at the two and forcing them into one of Naughty Dog's patented runaway sequences, while the show limits it to a single fungal fellow whom Ellie and Riley can't so easily escape. In both cases, Ellie ends up getting her first kill defending Riley. Game Ellie goes as hard on it as she can, a taste of what's to come from her efforts to protect those she loves. Show Ellie gets the kill on a swifter stroke, and her initial reaction is excitement. For a moment, overcoming an infected is just another thing making this night epic. Then both realize they've been bit. The night is turned on its head. What was meant to be a reckoning with their growing up and need to face the rest of their lives has turned into a fatal meeting with mortality. Ellie rages, smashing and screaming, while Riley remains docile. Ellie wants a way out, but Riley knows all too well that there isn't one, and the only options they have are to either end it now and spare themselves from turning, or, more poetically, wait it out, lose their minds together, and embrace every moment they have until that happens. Ellie goes with it, and while we don't see the results, we know how it turns out. I'm not really a fan of how the game just kinda ends it here, playing out to rock music like it's this epic moment when the tone feels deserving of something more tragic. The show does the same thing, but wisely brings it back around to Joel, Ellie showing that same fight for a way out, that drive to not let go, burning in her as she does whatever she can to keep Joel alive. The way her loss of Riley informs her efforts, feeling far more emphasized and fitting of the victorious score. Left Behind may not have been a part of the game on release, but it's hard to imagine the story feeling complete without it. Riley's fate and the connection she and Ellie shared are just too fundamental to Ellie's story. Ellie does tell Joel, and by extension the player, about what happened with her and Riley even without the DLC at the very end of the game in her and Joel's infamous final exchange, it being used to reveal the degree to which Ellie's been driven by her feeling as though she's supposed to be dead, that her getting to still be alive is unfair since Riley didn't get that chance under the same circumstances. There's impact to this moment even without Left Behind, but knowing the nuance of the relationship Ellie's talking about here, a relationship that went much deeper than friendship, makes the turmoil Ellie's feeling here all the more palpable. It also does a lot to bring the players closer to Ellie, to further cement this as her story as much as it is Joel's, her trauma as intimately explored as his. And speaking of trauma, both Ellie and Joel will have to make room for more, because we're heading into winter. The winter chapter of the game might be its shortest, but it's undoubtedly its most aggressive. The shot we enter on sets the tone. A cute white rabbit ducking out of the snow to sniff at the crisp winter air and thwack, dead in a blink. And here comes Ellie to take her prize. Keep in mind that without Left Behind, this is the first time we're seeing her since the university, so her being on her own immediately raises some alarms. When she sets her eyes on a grown buck, she follows it straight into trouble. The first brief bit where you're hunting the buck down is the calmest winter gets. Though if you're clumsy and keep setting the buck off before landing a hit, that call may be upset by your own frustration, as you run Ellie around and around this loop of forest until you can do so. Eventually, the wounded buck will break off this loop and die near some ruins, whereupon following it, Ellie runs into people, David and James. She manages to negotiate a trade with them at arrow point, David being oddly submissive to this young girl, even giving her his rifle while James goes to get medicine in exchange for the buck. As they wait, a whole ass horde of infected comes out of nowhere, forcing Ellie and David to work together in self-defense. It's a long, multi-stage sequence, the game's way of showing us before Left Behind could how far Ellie has come as a survivor, as well as tricking us into thinking David might be an alright guy, and not the creep he kind of comes across as. Returning to the buck after the horde finally dissipates, the tone between them has warmed a bit, which makes it all the more unsettling when David only now reveals that his group is the same one that encountered Joel and Ellie at the university. Something he seems to have suspected to be true since first laying eyes on Ellie. Yet still, even as his fellow James comes back with the jump on her, David lets Ellie go. Another strange moment from him, though one that turns out to be smart, as it allows his gang to track Ellie back to where she and Joel are hanging their hats. Rewinding a bit, the show approaches this from a different angle entirely, introducing us to David's group and that they previously fought with Joel and Ellie before having him run into Ellie and the buck. Here, we're shown that David is the sole leader of this group, whereas the game never clarifies the nature of the group's inner workings, David's control seeming tenuous based on the trash talk you hear from his subordinates. Show David, on the other hand, is very much in control of his group, reading scripture aloud under banners with religious-sounding mottos scrawled across them in a hard move toward the cultish. Not that it actually does much with scripture or religious ideas, it's all pretty vague, the point really being the sheer influence David commands over his people, who hang on his every word and decision. There's an effort here to expand on David's significance, critiquing the manipulative means through which he exerts control, portraying him as a quiet sociopath empowered by the apocalypse to carve out his own little fiefdom, promising people he's their only hope and knowing they're hopeless enough to buy it. It's a far more pointed use of character than how the game uses David, as there we're less invited to consider the plight of the people living under his thumb, seeing them more as an anonymous hostile mass, not much different than the other raided groups we've already encountered. In both cases, David comes to represent a uniquely unsettling threat to Ellie. In this world where most of the things that want to hurt her make no secret about it, David comes in with promises of how special Ellie is, how much he can care for her. Ellie's smart enough to know better, seeing that his intentions are harmful indeed, the game implying pretty strongly that David is a sexual predator, which the show is far more explicit about. For the game, the evil of this remains somewhat amorphous narratively, embodied in David, but most important for how Ellie must contend with it. Whereas the show also connects David's predatory nature to his leadership, his use of religion and fear to get what he wants from people, distinguishing him as an evil all too recognizable in our own world. Both of David's actors put in worthy performances, Scott Shepherd convincingly layering David's performative compassion with his true underlying menace, while Nolan North completely disappears into the role. An easier feat since it's not actually his face on the character, but still remarkable given how recognizable he'd become as Naughty Dog's other major protagonist at the time, Nathan Drake, whose plucky, wisecracking personality is a far cry from David's weird energy. With how much ambiguity the game's presentation of events provides, reading David becomes far more difficult, granting an uneasy quality to all his scenes with Ellie. Up until that point where he touches her hand all creepily, I was genuinely unsure what David's deal was. North absolutely selling David as this unreadable, tricky man, who turns out to be something more like a creature. Anyway, show David eventually gets around to the Buck and meets Ellie, this time she coming up on them rather than the other way around, which makes me question Ellie's judgment a bit, but whatever. While I wouldn't say the show flopped by not having Ellie and David tag team an entire horde of infected like in the game, the scene of them sitting by the Buck does feel hollow somehow. The conversation between them is fine, but the turn where David shows his hand comes well before Ellie, or the audience, has developed any meaningful trust in him, so the conversation's turn feels less meaningful. It's a simple thing, but the way that fighting alongside David in the game earns him our trust, even if just to undermine it in the very next scene, is a deliberately jarring move from the game, since it kind of calls out one of Naughty Dog's main character-building shortcuts. Put two characters in dire circumstances and force them to work together, and they'll naturally build trust. This isn't just for the player's sake either, it's true for the characters as well. Ellie may still be acting suspicious of David after the horde fight, but she puts her rifle down, warms her hands, clearly drops her guard as a result of the two having fought side by side. For the game, this kind of thing is half of what accounts for Joel and Ellie becoming as close as they have, and yet here it's used to essentially trick us into trusting someone. A subtle but effective subversion of the game's writing that makes the rivalry that goes on to play out between Ellie and David all the more effective. The show's efforts to connect David and Ellie don't come through as well, David trying to appeal to Ellie by claiming to understand her violent heart. In the game's version of events, where Ellie has murdered several of David's people by this point, I could see David making this case. But show Ellie has been comparably docile since her one messy kill in Kansas City, which makes it a strange case for show David to make. A transparently loaded exchange feeling more intended to signal how the audience should conceptualize Ellie rather than something David might actually think would convince her of anything. Seriously, what happened in the show that made David say this? Was it because Ellie was sassy to him and shot in his people's direction a couple times? Then there's the cannibal element, something the game uses to suggest a general degradation of humanity in David's group, where the show keeps their cannibalism a secret from the group's lesser members, using this to emphasize the degree to which David has nefariously misled them. Altogether, I like how this adds more personality to the group at large. They certainly feel far more human than Kathleen's Kansas City rowdy boys, but the other expansions on David's characterization feel like they're reaching for something the rest of the text doesn't quite convey, at least as far as he relates to Ellie. Ellie's capture in the hunter's continued hunt roused Joel rather miraculously from his wounded stupor. In the game, he's back to his old self, but for the show, this is the first time we're seeing Joel on the prowl, killing multiple of David's gang as they hunt him and dragging two away for interrogation. It's only a brief scene, but easily the most brutality we've seen from show Joel. He's ice cold as he ignores the pleas of the men he beats, torturing information out of them, then killing them anyway. Even in the game, where we've seen Joel kill more times than we can count, this scene stands out. There's a cruelty to it, a slight satisfaction Joel has as he tells the second guy he believed the first one, then bashes his head in. An emotional edge to his actions, where show Joel's deadpan delivery and stare feel more like dissociated pragmatism. To Game Joel's credit, these guys took Ellie, The first guy basically rubbing in Joel's face that David's probably going to hurt her. It's the most urgent and heinous threat to Ellie's safety Joel's faced up to this point, so maybe he can't help but take some satisfaction in ending these guys. This isn't the same disconnected, everyday violence we've been through with Joel so far. This is personal, and it's only the start of what Joel's capable of when Ellie's life is on the line. This is where the real profundity of The Last of Us lies. In all its forms and adaptations, it's not afraid of evoking the ugliest parts of its characters, of showing just how dark they're willing to be, but never superfluously, always deliberate in portraying that their worst comes out when what they love is at stake, when someone dear to them has been threatened or taken. The hatred in their deeds reflects the depths of their love, or often their pain at love that has been lost. In simpler words, hurt people, and The Last of Us is full of hurt people. But those hurt people can love too. And when they do, boy should you look out. As much as Joel is back to his old self, it doesn't turn out entirely necessary, as Ellie continues to prove craftier than any of the adults she's up against, a clever ploy with her bite giving her the chance she needs to slash and run. She still ends up trapped in a lodge with David though, a sequence echoed in both adaptations. It's a unique encounter for the game, and the closest thing it has to a traditional boss fight, the player needing to get 3 stealth attacks on David to bring him down, having no other way to damage him. It's certainly more video gamey than the regular combat, and David somehow being better at getting stabbed than his peers is goofy on the face of it. But the way David gets progressively more dangerous and terrifying with each new phase redeems the experience for me. The lodge is massive and layered, and once David starts crouching like you, he becomes hard to keep track of without alerting him to your position. And when just being near him can kill you, this can be quite panic-inducing, which feels appropriate given how much this encounter is supposed to stick with Ellie. The furious, panicked way she butchers him when she finally gets the chance is both savagely cathartic and a disturbing blowout of her trauma. That and the terrified yelp Nolan North makes at the fall of the first swing just makes this one of the most memorable villain deaths in anything for me. The show's version of this all works fine enough, even if my previous gripes still ride through this scene as well. And come on, Scott Shepard doesn't even cry out when he gets butchered. He just makes the most unaffected sound, just a little nowhere near as punchy. Just saying. Winter ends with Joel and Ellie reuniting, him finding her still shocked and shaking from her encounter with David. Heck, she's still butchering him when Game Joel finds her. Ellie seems almost ready to swing for Joel too before realizing it's him, and only then does she ease up and break down. So little is actually said, but Joel sort of says it all when he calls her baby girl, just like he called Sarah, without even thinking to. Here, holding Ellie shaking in his arms, he finally comes to accept her as the daughter he feels her to be. Following this scene and moving on to spring, and with it the final episode of the season, we find Joel in a brighter mood than we've maybe ever seen him prior to the story's very beginning. Letting himself feel for Ellie is good for Joel, and it seems he's finally figured that out. There's a pair of scenes exclusive to one version or another that happen at pretty much the same moment as Joel and Ellie are passing through an early outbreak medical encampment, prompting Joel to share some of his experiences from that time. In the game, Joel talks about Sarah for the first time since she came up during his and Ellie's fight near Jackson, and it reminds Ellie of a photo of the two of them Maria gave her. Tommy had actually tried to give Joel the same photo at the time, but Joel refused it, just saying he's good. His attitude of forget and move on working as intended. This time though, when Ellie hands him the photo, now that he's accepted the love of a new daughter, Joel finally is able to hold on to it. Somewhat begrudgingly. The pain isn't gone, but he seems to finally feel that the pain is worth the memory. This also emphasizes how Ellie entering his life doesn't erase Sarah, actually allowing Joel to mourn her better than he'd previously been able to. The show does something different, if prompted by the same setting, Joel confessing to Ellie that he attempted suicide shortly after Sarah's death. Details leading up to this reveal are evident throughout the season, making it feel established as a major moment in Joel's past that is substantial for him to be sharing. In doing so, expressing to Ellie how much she has come to mean to him. It weren't Tom that healed him, he tells her, meaning, of course, that she did. All the years he'd been living since the end of the world had been spent wounded, but now he's finally feeling a bit of his old self, a self he'd counted for dead long ago. Rewinding a bit though, Ellie comes into the spring chapter still very much haunted by the events of winter, and though she doesn't speak on her exact feelings, her unease is clear in her behavior. Joel, in his brightened mood, is suddenly the chatty one, talking about wanting to teach Ellie to play guitar, and she barely even responds. Joel doesn't know what to say to her, and maybe there's nothing that he really can say. The whole encounter with David was something far more invasive and unnerving than anything else the pair have had to contend with, and with it there's a sense that any innocence left in Ellie has been drained. As we're coming to grips with this, however, the story hits us with one of its most famous and optimistically charged moments. Ellie sees something out of Joel's view and runs off in excitement, Joel having to hurry to catch up and find the source of her wonder. A giraffe. There's a small herd of them passing by, and one happens to be chomping on some shrubbery right there, close enough to touch, and somehow it lets them, not seeing them as threats for some miraculous reason. And it is in many ways a miraculous moment. This stunning creature, not native to this land which itself was a city, largely stripped of nature long ago, yet somehow these disparate elements have found harmony. To Ellie, the giraffe is a marvel of the old world that is not dead, something alive that is not dangerous, a rare instance of the world producing something friendly and spectacular. When the giraffe moves on, the pair move to get a better view of the herd, and for once the dead, abandoned landscape of an empty city feels gorgeous. You could almost forget all the death connected to this place. But that's the beauty of the scene and its spontaneity, reminding Ellie that there are bright things still in the world. And for Joel, seeing Ellie's smile light up again is all the reassurance he needs. At the tail end of the scene, something compels Joel to stop and tell Ellie that they don't have to keep going if she doesn't want to. They could just go back to Jackson right now, stop bothering with the Fireflies, and go enjoy the lives they found renewed meaning in. That may be how Joel feels, but Ellie's still committed to the task they left Boston with all those months back. Everything they've endured in that time, everything they've been forced to do, has to amount to something. And it's hard to disagree with her, even knowing what going forward means. Since our heroes are about to finally meet the Fireflies, I think it's time we got into their portrayal more in depth, since in both versions it can be somewhat vague. Early on, they're characterized as a resistance movement, combating Fedra's authoritarianism, though their fight is clearly a losing one by the state of things in Boston. The game actually uses Firefly medallions as collectibles, hidden throughout the world, showing how far their influence spreads, if also emphasizing how poorly they must be faring to leave so many corpses around for Joel to pilfer. This lends to understanding the Fireflies less as a logistically informed force and more symbolically, humanity's fleeting, fighting chance against permanently succumbing to the hell of what the world has become. The way the game often frames the Fireflies emphasizes this, as they come up all the time, not just because you're looting their corpses, but because they're talked of and sought out by characters both principal to the story and only gleaned through scavenged notes, but always presented as a symbol of hope, an ambition towards a better humanity. Now, we of course could and should challenge such claims from a logical perspective, but there's not a whole lot of logic here to challenge, since the true scale of the Fireflies is left ambiguous and their ideology is limited to opposing the last dregs of the government, with no details as to how they'd run things in its place. So arguing against the Fireflies or their goals becomes just arguing against the greater good of mankind, and if that feels vaguely defined, that might be the point. This is essential to understanding the narrative framing of Joel's big choice, a choice that the show has reopened for endless, anxious debate online. There are so many posts online from people tearing the Fireflies apart, how what they're doing makes no sense and how they're clearly incompetent, so Joel was of course acting rationally when he wiped them all out to save Ellie. Questioning the good of self-proclaimed heroic groups is wise on the face of it, but here it feels like an insincere way of engaging with what the story is trying to do. Yes, there's good reason to be skeptical of the Fireflies, but what's important about them is that they are the only ones who would even try to fix the world given the chance. They may not be a safe bet, but they're the only bet the future has, assuming you want the future to look different than the post-apocalyptic present. Take the scene where this entire dilemma is laid out for us and for Joel by Marlene. In both versions of the story, the Fireflies don't exactly react kindly to Joel and Ellie wandering into their territory, and they end up knocking Joel unconscious. We don't see what happens to Ellie, we jump right to Joel waking up in the Firefly-occupied hospital. And hey, here's Marlene, ready to tell Joel all this stuff. How considerate. It's about as condensed a way of getting to the point as I can possibly imagine, almost jarringly so, almost as if we're not really supposed to stop and think about any of this for all that long. It boils down to weighing Ellie's life against the lives of everyone else, and on that question, Joel and Marlene are opposed. The season finale actually opens with an oddly familiar woman's grunting, at least to those of us who've played the games, as the original Ellie herself, Ashley Johnson, takes on the very meta role of Ellie's mother, Anna. We find her struggling through the woods, heavily pregnant and alarmingly alone. She finds shelter in a house, but it doesn't stop the season's last infected from nibbling her a little bit, in a struggle that ends with the abrupt childbirth of Ellie. I have no idea how realistic this is, and I don't really care, because it's hilarious, and I mean that in a good way. What a way for Ellie to enter the world. Only problem is that bite, of course. Anna cuts her umbilical cord quickly, then takes up her baby in her arms and hopes for the best. She'll die not knowing if her daughter didn't just turn a few hours later, not knowing that she stumbled into the recipe for free community. Apparently. I'm pretty firmly in the camp of we didn't need an explanation for Ellie's immunity and think this is kind of silly, But I still definitely like the scene itself, and think it was an excellent way to open the episode and elaborate on Marlene's deeper history with Ellie. Ellie is basically a niece to Marlene, so close were she and Anna, but even Anna knows to ask Marlene to find someone else to raise Ellie, knowing Marlene's too dedicated to the goals of the Fireflies to raise a kid. So Marlene drops Ellie off with the enemy, putting her in Fedra's care, knowing that she'll be safest there. As we learned in Left Behind, Marlene has gone out of her way to ensure Ellie stays out of the fighting, actively not wanting her to get dragged into her mother's struggle. Now, however, with Ellie being the key to the vaccine, Marlene is forced to compromise her promise to Anna for the sake of the world at large. I believe Marlene when she says to Joel that she's the one making the bigger sacrifice. Not because I think it's true, but because Ellie does matter to her in an incredibly personal way, and because of how she views Joel. It's interesting that Marlene respects Joel enough to tell him what's going to happen to Ellie, yet also clearly still thinks of him as the scummy smuggler she knew in Boston. It just doesn't occur to Marlene that Joel, whom she remarks on as having a ruthless, pragmatic reputation, wouldn't care enough about some random girl to actually try and stop her, let alone wipe out a massive number of her people in the process. I can understand fans who might be frustrated by Marlene's seeming stupidity at giving Joel a chance to stop her by telling him anything at all, but it works to show how she's underestimated Joel's capacity for love, assuming he'd take this news on the chin and keep on keeping on. Maybe Boston Joel would have, but we're a long way from Boston, and Marlene's made a big mistake, one that'll cost her and her cause everything. What follows is the emotional climax of the whole story, Joel's relentless tear through the hospital to get to Ellie, clearing the board of Fireflies as he goes. For the show, it's the best look we get at Joel's inner killer, Pascal maneuvering him through the montage-like sequence with a removed, merciless efficiency, the whole thing sonically drowned out with heavy, deep strings, doing more to put us in Joel's headspace than any of the show's other action scenes ever attempted. I do wish there'd been a bit more of a struggle in Joel's efforts. As is, he just has such an easy time dispatching what is supposed to be a militant faction that vastly outnumbers him. Sure, he's not exactly John Wick, but it does make Joel seem a bit superhuman in what otherwise feels like a grounded depiction of violence, the kind that I think the rest of the show could have used more of, and I don't think it would have taken away from this scene's impact. Contrarily, I think it would have enhanced it. This is the effect the game has in the sequence, since here, we're used to Joel being unexplainably just better at fighting than everyone. But now, seeing his violence used against a group we've up to this point been conditioned to view as the good guys, that violence feels more malicious. Joel isn't the scrappy survivor doing what needs to be done here, he's a cold-blooded killer. That sadistic edge we saw hinted at in the torture scene earlier coming out in full force as Ellie's life is threatened. The way he mutters, "I don't have time for this," and just gutshots the guard to expedite his torture conveys such anger, such complete lack of empathy for this guy, and is the moment for me when this went from "what's Joel gonna do" to "holy shit, Joel's actually doing this." He's throwing everyone else under the bus for his own desires, and he's totally fine killing to make that happen. Which betrays a depth of selfishness that our closeness to Joel as players may have prevented us from realizing, even if the signs all along were pointing to this being whom Joel always was. Where the game arguably stumbles is in its encounter design. You better pray that you came into the scene stocked with ammo, because the game hasn't suddenly become less stingy about giving it to you, even though it's also throwing way more and way better equipped enemies at you than ever before. Sure, it gives you a new machine gun, but it feels oddly underpowered, and again, is very limited in ammo. Seriously, on my grounded playthrough of the game a few years ago, I got stuck on these last few fights for a stupid amount of time, because I simply didn't have the resources to pull it off. And even on my easier difficulty playthroughs, this last stretch always felt disproportionately balanced somehow. In terms of arena design, the hospital starts out fine enough with some pretty large and intricately connected spaces, but ends on a sour note with this last hallway of enemies who just stay in place and wait for you, thus severely limiting the player's options of approach compared to most of the fights where the enemies are allowed to behave more dynamically. I mean, you could at least try and sneak by all the guys in the section before this, but here that's not really an option. Sure, defensively speaking, it makes sense for the Fireflies to hold down the fort like this against Joel's assault, but from a game design perspective, as the game's final combat sequence, it's a bit of a letdown. Following the actual combat though, the game wisely keeps you in control of what could easily have been a cutscene, but is so much more powerful for not being one. We make our final approach on the room where Ellie is about to be cut open, barging in with the blood of our recent kills still marking our footsteps. We enter the operation room, and the lead surgeon brandishes a knife to us, determined not to let us take away humanity's last hope for salvation. Joel kills him, either upon your approach, or, if you've just gotten into character at this point, should you choose to shoot him. Either way, there's no sparing him. You can even kill the two assisting him if you like, the game I suppose letting you decide how completionist Joel feels the need to be with eradicating the threat to Ellie's life. Joel takes Ellie in his arms and books it through one last runaway sequence as the Fireflies give chase. Though rather than the heart-pounding tension these scenes are usually meant to provoke, the feeling here is somber and tragic, reinforced by the music and the hazy lighting of the hospital as Joel barrels through. The angry, violent man who murdered his way here dissolves into the worried father, carrying Ellie the same way he carried Sarah in the prologue, muttering that she's going to be okay, desperate to keep his daughter safe from those who would hurt her, needing to succeed where before he failed. This need trumps everything else, even the thoughts and feelings of the very daughter he's done all this to save. Ellie's agency in this matter is muddied. She seemingly never agreed to anything in either version, but we know her well enough at this point to know that she probably would give her life if it meant her immunity could be of use, and Joel knows this too. Marlene points this out in an attempt to sway him, and for a moment we're allowed to think it might have worked, that Joel might have swallowed his grief for the sake of Ellie's wishes. Heck, they could have woken her up and asked her straight up what she wants. But because Joel knows what that would mean, it cannot be. He won't lose another daughter, even by her own will. So he shoots Marlene, packs Ellie's unconscious body in a truck, finishes Marlene off for good, and drives. By the time Ellie wakes up, he's come up with a story about the Fireflies already finding others who were immune and having given up on searching for a cure. It's not a good story, and if Ellie weren't doped up on meds when she first hears it, she'd absolutely call him out. But that's not the case, so all she feels now is confusion, disappointment, and failure. Joel tells her he's sorry. I'm deeply curious exactly what he feels sorry about, but the beauty of The Last of Us ending is how bravely it embraces its characters' ambiguities. It really is the ending that brings the whole game together, elevating everything that came before. So much of the story, however well told, feels pulled from the established building blocks of zombie apocalypse narratives that have come before. I can even recall first playing the game back in 2013 and sort of rolling my eyes when it was revealed that Ellie's immune, like, oh, so that's what this game is going to be about. These characters are going to save the world, huh? That's boring. And events were fairly predictable from there, only for the story to pull off this major subversion at the end. The world isn't saved. If anything, it's more doomed now than at the start of the game. And not because our heroes failed, but because one of them got exactly what he wanted. We may have been with Joel through the worst of his deeds, but at the very end, the game puts us back in Ellie's shoes. It's a very short sequence, just a minute or two of walking before the final cutscene, but it's included as an opportunity to see Joel from the outside, reinforcing both our distance from him and Ellie's disconnection from him as she struggles with the truth. She's had enough time to process things and is clearly having doubts about Joel's telling of events, even if mistrusting Joel goes against everything she's come to rely on. Joel, on the other hand, is in the same chatty mood he was at the start of spring, almost uncomfortably chipper after everything that's happened. Eventually overlooking Jackson, a jog away from finally settling into safety and normalcy, Ellie asks Joel to wait. It's here where she finally tells him about Riley, how she expected to die with her best friend, and how she's still waiting for her turn. It's her way of addressing her feelings of failure, that Riley and Tess and Sam and everyone she killed died for nothing. Joel tries to console her, telling her that it may not be what she wants to hear, but sometimes things don't work out. But you can't let that be it for you. You have to find something else to fight for, and if you let yourself keep living, you will. It's a lesson the years have taught Joel again and again, it seems, and he tries to instill it in Ellie now to calm her unease, to get her to accept the good thing they have coming to them, believing in his heart that it is what's best for both of them. I think it's worth acknowledging that much of Ellie's feelings of failure come from her survivor's guilt, and as noble as sacrificing herself for humanity would be, it does sort of feed into that guilt, validating it as an appropriate way for Ellie to conceptualize herself. Joel's appeal here is, in a way, actually kind of healthy and life-affirming, trying to get her to see that she has more to live for than whatever her immunity might be worth. Ellie deserves to live as much as anyone. She deserves a chance to be happy, and because of what Joel did, she has a chance to do both. Of course, it doesn't quite end there. Ellie doesn't drop the topic, demanding that Joel swear he's telling her the truth about the Fireflies. Joel, lying as easily as he kills, says he is. And whether or not Ellie believes him, well, all we get is that deliciously ambiguous okay. Since it's my video, I'll give my take. Ellie wants to believe Joel because she loves him, but she's also smart enough to know that his story doesn't add up. To accept that Joel has betrayed her is too painful, too vast in its implications, but to accept that he's telling the truth goes against her gut, undermines everything she's had her heart set on for the last year. She could argue, she could fight, but where would it get her? So she resigns herself to not knowing, accepting, or trying to accept, that she's not getting answers, but that her life is going to go on regardless. Okay. There is really no one way of reading the line. It's intended to be ambiguous, an unresolved chord that hangs over the story and forces us to come to our own conclusions. At least it worked that way back when The Last of Us was a one-off, open and closed story, and not a multimedia franchise with one sequel already out and almost certainly more to come. Not to mention however many seasons of the show we're bound to get. This doesn't ruin the moment's ambiguity really, but it does ruin its finality. Since we know we're going to be spending more time with these characters, their stories aren't actually done the way they were when this ending was first written. I hope I'm not spoiling anything when I say that Part 2 doesn't just leave all this stuff behind. We get to see unambiguously how it goes on to affect the characters' lives. I do think this detracts from the ending, not so much as to ruin it by any means, but the impact is lessened, knowing that it's far from the last word we're going to get on the subject. Ignoring all that and judging it as a singular piece, The Last of Us game is a masterfully crafted work of post-apocalyptic media, an essentially human story, unafraid of getting its hands dirty with moral ambiguity. While structurally quite predictable, its tight approach to character development keeps it fresh and grounded, and the performances by its two leads remain among the absolute best ever given in the medium. Everything about the game works towards its vision, a rare feat in the realm of AAA gaming, and part of what makes it already feel like a long-loved classic, even though at time of writing it hasn't even been out a full 10 years. HBO's television adaptation was never going to be as big of a fish in its pond as its game counterpart, though it's evidently managed to make quite the splash nevertheless. I don't love the show, I think I've made that pretty clear, but 20,000 plus words of coming to grips with its relationship to its source material have allowed me to better respect it and the talented work of those who brought it to life. I really do wish I could view it without any knowledge of the game just to see if it would resonate with me better, but sadly, that ain't how brain work. My often nitpicky opinions on its quality aside, I am without a doubt invested in the show now, if mostly because of where it has to go from here. I was very skeptical about the necessity of a Part 2 when it was first announced, but it ended up being a really solid game, sometimes better and often more interesting than the first. So I'm going to keep an open mind about the show, if only because I'm fascinated to see how it handles adapting that beast of a narrative, whether it be for better or for worse. Or perhaps the show will surprise us and go its own way. There's only so much story in the games to adapt after all, and why should the creators limit themselves to that if they should find new or more compelling avenues to explore? Honestly, that's probably the best chance the show has if it ever wants to truly outshine its source material, as I just don't think it's ever going to be able to tell the game's stories as well, not for a lack of competence on the creator's part, but simply because those stories were written to be played, and that's an extremely hard factor to account for when trying to retell a game's story, and I do think the creators underestimated that here in the first season. Perhaps they'll figure this out going forward, or perhaps they'll diverge from the games more meaningfully. Or perhaps they'll just do what they did the first time around since it seems to have worked out well for them. I'm sure television producers across the industry are already looking at HBO's The Last of Us as a blueprint for how to adapt video games into shows, and while it may very well be the best game-to-screen adaptation ever produced, I'd hate to remember it as the herald of a new era of video game adaptations that make its same mistakes.